It's great to be here. My charge here today is to talk for a few minutes about the South Asia context and chapter that you read. I'd just start by saying I'd encourage all of you to buy the book. It's a terrific book, and what I really enjoyed, just to underscore two key threads that run through this book, is it really illuminates how BRI is interacting with the domestic politics of countries on China's periphery. And so it's not just looking at states as sort of black box units like international relations theorists tend to do, but it gets into the politics of these states and figures out how BRI is and how China's engagement more broadly is shaping how these states work. The other thing that I really like that it teases out in all of the different regions is how China's engagement is upsetting some of the longstanding patterns, or maybe exacerbating some of the longstanding patterns that exist between and among states on China's periphery. And we certainly see this in South Asia with the India-Pakistan dynamic. So I wanted to share just a few comments that bring what is already a very timely book up to date, sort of to the present moment, with some of the recent things that have been happening. Hopefully these comments will help you engage in your small groups or your breakout groups with some of the larger themes. So a few comments before we move to Q&A. The first broad observation I would make is that CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor that Professor Markey wrote about in this chapter, it really continues to evolve, and the book lays out some of the major trend lines, and those really are evolving. And I just want to highlight, three ways in which the CPEC project continues to evolve in really interesting ways. The first is that we are seeing even more interest by the Pakistani army, which in many ways dominates the policymaking apparatus of the state, to get involved in more overt and consequential ways in the management of CPEC, of this particular aspect of China's investment and engagement with Pakistan. Now you might say, doesn't the army already do everything in Pakistan anyway? Doesn't it control everything? And in a sense, the army has many lines of influence to shape the behavior of the Pakistani state. It is focused quite a lot of its attention on managing the things that matter most to it, which are relations with India, relations with Afghanistan, and to some extent engagement with the United States, China, and other players. But what's interesting with CPEC is that its engagement has gotten more overt. There is already today a retired general running the CPEC authority, but there have been proposals even in the last few weeks to move legislation that would increase even to a greater extent the military's role in CPEC and the kind of autonomy and authority that it would have to negotiate directly with China about the kinds of projects, to oversee the projects, and to essentially remove this from civilian oversight. Now, if you're the army, this might sound like a positive step forward because you have more control and more influence, but the army also faces a conundrum here. It's sort of the, what did, was it Colin Powell who said that, you break it, you own it theory. The more that the military gets overtly involved in economic policy making, the more it has to take responsibility when projects go over budget, when they increase the debt, when they cause other economic challenges. And so it really is an open question whether the army has much of anything to gain from a more visible engagement with this signature project. The second trend that continues to evolve is that I do think there's rising skepticism in Pakistan broadly about the real economic value of these investments. And this is not unique to Pakistan. If you've been reading the newspapers, you've probably noticed that the United States under the Trump administration has been promulgating repeatedly and very loudly a narrative of China's debt trap diplomacy. The idea that China is luring countries in to more debt than they can handle, and then it will use that leverage to get something that it wants in the political space or maybe with regard to defense basing or other things. Now, this story, I think, is slightly oversimplified, slightly overblown, but it has had resonance throughout much of Asia in, I think, a very helpful way. Part of the Trump administration strategy, as I understand it, they don't put it this way, but it is to frighten small countries around Asia about the risks of taking on Chinese debt, about the risks of taking on investment that probably doesn't comply with international standards on labor and environment and debt sustainability and transparency and the other things that the United States and its partners have gotten pretty good at. Some of that message has resonated in Pakistan as well, with Pakistanis wondering what they are getting from these projects. And those conversations have really been exacerbated by the fact that Pakistan's macroeconomic environment is really quite a mess at the moment. They have an IMF program, plus now COVID-19 is anticipated to do some pretty significant shocks to the Pakistani economy over the coming years. So this skepticism is in part because of what Pakistan is itself experiencing, and in part because of, I think, a narrative driven from Washington that has caused countries around Asia to think twice before accepting these kind of Chinese investments on the terms at which they're offered. The third interesting trend line is that there are large and, if anything, growing questions about the roadmap for CPEC, about the what's next with this project. The first wave of investments, as Dr. Markey mentions and really discusses in such great detail in this chapter, many of them had to do with roads, and there were debates about where the road should run to advantage or disadvantage different communities. There were investments in power generation, and there's been some investment in rail and a few other things, some in the other investments in the energy space. But if you look beyond road, rail, dam projects, and energy generation, because frankly, Pakistan now has a glut of energy production. If you look to the next phase, it's a little bit hazy as to what comes next. The Pakistanis and the Chinese have talked about technology, about agriculture, about industrial zones, but Pakistanis are right to wonder if these are actually just a mirage, right? And so I think this really fits with the theme of this chapter, that China's investment is going to raise questions within Pakistan itself about what is really on offer for Pakistanis with this kind of investment. It's one thing to say, we're going to build roads you can see, we're going to build dams that help provide energy. But when you get into areas like agriculture and industry, these can become very, very political, right? There are all kinds of other political issues that arise that I think the Chinese haven't fully dealt with. So that's the first basket of updates, is really what's happening with CPEC, with the still very substantial projected investments by China in Pakistan. The second thing that I wanted to mention are some of the broader geopolitical shifts that are underway. And these you would also have seen in the newspaper. There's been a lot going on geopolitically in South Asia over the last 6 months. The first observation I would have is that you might have noticed that there is a greater perception of polarization in Asia, with China and Pakistan on the one hand, and the United States and India and the so-called Quad countries, adding Japan and Australia on the other hand. Now, these aren't like Cold War blocs. We shouldn't think in Cold War terms at this moment, but this sense of polarization does matter. I would notice a few things. The first is that China actually doesn't have a lot of friends in Asia, and the friends that it has, it's not very good at keeping friends. We see some of this in South Asia, but we see more of it in Southeast Asia, where China is actually not as good at the soft power game as one would expect, given the sheer volume of capital that it has to throw around. But the other observation in this vein is that the kinds of polarization that people in Asia are now, I think, feeling more acutely, could become even more stark. There's been some very interesting reports over the last few weeks about the prospect of a major Chinese deal with Iran. And if this comes to fruition, China would presumably provide billions of dollars over the course of years to Iran for investment, trying to help Iran move around the very constricting US-led sanctions regimes. And in return, Iran would provide a steady supply of reliable energy to China. If this materializes, then this would further, I think, advance the sense of polarization. It would also probably make India nervous in some meaningful ways. India has longstanding ties with Iran, but Iran has been disappointed at India's ability to follow through with its economic investments in Iran. And it may make Pakistan nervous as well. Pakistan has a publicly positive relationship with Iran, but in private, it's much more contentious. They probably would worry about seeing some of the investment dollars that were allocated for Pakistan diverted to Iran in such an arrangement. So this is still a very dynamic chessboard in Asia, and some of these fault lines, I think, should very much be part of the conversation as you think about, in the context of Dr. Markey's book, how China's engagement is shaping the behavior of different countries. The final thing I would say is really in this vein, and that is we've seen very public clashes between India and China on the border this summer. And there's a great New York Times explainer that shows some 3D renderings of the river valleys. It'll give you some inkling as to why indeed it would be useful for China to have gained high ground in areas where it could look over strategic Indian roads. So there are tactical and operational reasons why China might have made the moves that it did this summer along the line of actual control, which is an undemarcated border. What is more interesting than the tactical confusion are the strategic questions. What on earth would constitute a reasonable Chinese logic, a strategic logic for undertaking these kind of moves? At best, it seems the Chinese have gained some incremental territory that would help them in a more heated conflict, but they have also reaped some substantial disadvantages. The Indian leadership is seriously nonplussed at the moment. They have banned a whole host of Chinese apps and websites that, in dollar terms, don't represent a lot of trade value, but over the long arc could really rupture India's potential engagement with a suite of Chinese technology that could be disadvantageous to the Chinese. It's made China look like a bully, and it will probably accelerate certain dimensions of the U.S.-India defense relationship. Why does that make any sense for China? This is still a huge question, and it's an open question. And I think it's one you should think about in the context of your discussion here. The final thing on this point is that both India and China have walked themselves into different corners, but corners nonetheless over the last few weeks. For India, the Prime Minister Modi, is trying to walk a very difficult line where he, on the one hand, says that India has not ceded an inch of its territory to China, but on the other hand, is visibly retaliating against China for its aggressive and coercive actions, right? If that doesn't entirely make sense to you, I think it's because it doesn't entirely make sense, and there is a really complicated and limiting political logic here. I'm going to stop there so we have time for Q&A. I, like you, I think, have not seen the excellent questions that Hasta has prepared, but I would just throw one other question into the mix for you to think about in this group discussion, or maybe as you fall asleep at night. There's an argument to be made that the India-China border clashes might make China more enthusiastic about investing in CPEC. But there's another line of thought that says those border clashes could make China less enthusiastic about investing in CPEC as opposed to other areas of South Asia. And I would encourage you to think about the different arguments on both sides. If you were China, how would you read the present moment as a signal for your enthusiasm to continue investing tens of billions of dollars in a country like Pakistan? I will stop there, and I think we have some questions. You know, this I think is it's a good question, and I would just refer you back to the point I made about a growing sense of polarization. I mean, the United States has a complicated on again, off again relationship with Pakistan. If you want to learn more about that, I would refer you to Dr. Markey's excellent first book, No Exit from Pakistan. It's about the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. That relationship is not in a bad place right now, but it's also not in a great place. It's settled into a much sort of lower base. And I think even if Americans think that they are in a position to balance a little bit between India and Pakistan, to exert leverage with both, the Pakistanis probably don't feel that way. They feel that the environment is much more polarized and that the United States really doesn't have much leverage there. We haven't talked about Afghanistan in this conversation, but the reality is that even if things go swimmingly with the peace process in Afghanistan, it is still the case that the United States will need Pakistan to undertake some regular forms of cooperation against groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. That kind of requirement is really not going away. And that means that the United States will have to maintain reasonable terms with Pakistan, even as it deepens ties with India. Similarly, if you're China, you have a deep relationship that looks like an alliance with Pakistan, but China also wants to maintain good ties, or at least reasonably good ties with India. India is a huge market. It's going to be the world's most populous country quite soon. And China has to be thinking about wanting access to that consumer market. So I think both the United States and China can't afford to see a highly polarized environment. Well, I mentioned that China's not good at keeping friends. Pakistan's not good at making friends. It certainly has China as a major patron. It has long looked to Saudi Arabia and to some extent the UAE for financial support. Much of that comes in terms of energy concessions. But Pakistan's relationship with Saudi Arabia is somewhat more fraught than in the past, in part because many of the Gulf states are now looking at India as maybe not a more important prize, but certainly a much larger market for energy, the ties of migrant labor from South Asia. I think in many of these countries are increasingly coming from India and not from Pakistan. So there are broader shifts for the reason why countries in the Gulf, I think, are looking at India more seriously. So the short answer is that Pakistan does not have a lot of options. If the United States remains cautious about providing assistance to Pakistan, and then if China scales down its support and Saudi Arabia and UAE are not likely to pick up a lot of the slack, it doesn't have many places to turn for that kind of assistance. And there's a similar story when it comes to defense production. Pakistan is looking much more toward China, but it's also been in conversation with the Russians about diversifying its defense base. Well, it's complicating most everything in the region. I think, you know, the surprise is that Pakistan appears to have squeaked by with a lower impact than other countries in the region. I think the jury's still out on India. So in a sense, it hasn't been a non-event. There will still likely be significant impacts on GDP. But this is one of these instances where Pakistan benefits from the fact that its economy is still somewhat more autarkic than it should be. They don't export very much. And what they do export is not highly diversified. And so in this kind of environment, they're not like Bangladesh, which relies very heavily on garment exports in order to keep the economy afloat. So it hasn't been a huge impact in this context. There have been some impacts in Afghanistan that I think maybe have impacted the peace process there. That's a little bit too early to say, but overall the impacts have been lower than we expected. I think the most significant impact is likely that the shock to Pakistan's economy means that its macroeconomic profile is even more fragile than it already was, which means Pakistan is even more reliant on the IMF and international financial institutions to shape its economic path going forward. That does give the United States a considerable amount of leverage if it wanted to use it in shaping Pakistan's future path. I would say that there's simply not a lot of trade that flows today between Western China and Pakistan. The geography even before desertification explains some of that. So one of the things that I think is highlighted in this book is that there is this very appealing idea that China can build active and sort of regenerate ancient trade links between its West and South and Central Asia, and certainly CPEC is one effort to do that. Those of us who study this are not entirely convinced that CPEC is a great name for the project, because the connectivity dimension of CPEC very much seems subordinate to other dimensions. I mean, the road and rail will largely benefit transit within Pakistan. The energy production is energy for Pakistan. So China, I think, hasn't quite cracked the code of how to make transit links across some of the world's highest mountain passes economically viable. And that's why this next phase of CPEC that I mentioned is so interesting. Can they actually think about manufacturing or agriculture investments in Pakistan? Maybe some of that production or investment some of the production would then flow back into China. Maybe some of it would be Chinese investment in Pakistan that would then be for export to the Gulf. It's really unclear how they're conceptualizing that kind of forward investment. When Pakistani political leaders have been asked about the ongoing atrocities in Xinjiang, what I think most of us would consider a campaign of genocide against the Uyghur Muslims, their response has been a sort of, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. It's not to be partisan about it, but it's almost like when you ask a Senate Republican in Washington whether he's seen President Trump's tweets about something. He says, I just don't read his tweets, as if it's never occurred to them to follow what the president says. It's a convenient way of not having to engage the issue. And I think we very much see that here from Prime Minister Khan to the military leaders. They've sort of pretended like they don't know. In private, Pakistani officials are, of course, both worried and embarrassed about the fact that they're worried about what's happening. They're embarrassed about the fact that they can't speak. They don't feel like they can speak out about it without political retribution from China. And Pakistan, because it has not made many friends in the region or among great powers, does not have a lot of options for investment and patronage. So it has regretfully held its tongue on what I think many of us would agree is one of the worst ongoing crimes of the 21st century. And it's a very sad thing to see. Yeah, it's a good question. I think as Dr. Markey notes in this book, and to some extent in his previous book, which you should also buy, some of the Chinese investment and engagement with Pakistan really predated any branding efforts related to One Belt, One Road or Belt and Road the Belt and Road Initiative or the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. But a variety of things, some of which were already in motion, were very cleverly rebranded as part of BRI and CPEC. So there were longstanding forms of cooperation that were rebranded in this way. But in that sense, she has really put a lot of energy and priority into engaging with South and Central Asia in a way that his predecessors simply didn't. And that has really raised the profile of something like CPEC, which, as Dr. Markey knows, at various times has been called a flagship kind of project. If you take a step back and think about how Xi Jinping is different than his predecessors, you really do see over the last few years a willingness by Xi Jinping and the political elite not to pretend like they are still waiting for their chance on the world stage. You see an assertiveness, you see a willingness to act like a great power, or how they think a great power should act. And in some cases, this is, I think, from a U.S. perspective, very helpful. I think it's good that China was engaged in negotiating with the Taliban. Was it substantively useful? Not really, but I think China did it for reputational reasons. This is how a great power should act. It should be involved in mediating long-standing conflicts. In other places, though, we've seen this assertiveness really be problematic. We've seen disregard for, in flagrant public ways, for international law and international norms in the South China Sea. We've seen coercive behavior against small states. These are the kind of behaviors that in East Asia, in the Western Pacific, are often associated with territorial disputes. But there really is a concern that some of this same kind of assertive and aggressive behaviors will begin showing up more and more in South Asia. That's why the Sino-Indian border clashes are so worrisome. And I think it would be good for all of you to keep in mind as you read through these chapters to think about what it will look like if China becomes even more confident and assertive in its engagements with its Western periphery, as it in the same way that it has in the Western Pacific, where it has greater stakes and active territorial disputes. It's not something that I'm wishing on South and Central Asia, but it's something that I think all South and Central Asian leaders and analysts are having to think about. What if the China that we see in the Western Pacific increasingly shows up in South and Central Asia? What kind of world does that look like? And does it mean that countries are going to want to bind themselves more closely to the United States or other countries with which they can balance?